Okay, so now we're going to talk about the phenomenological, existential / phenomenological psychiatrists and their theories from the 1950s. And as I mentioned to you before, a lot of their thinking was motivated by what had happened in World War II. When I lectured to you last, I pointed out, I described Nietzsche and Dostoevsky's summation of the world situation and really the world psychological situation at the end of the 1800s, and that was that our new modes of thinking had undermined our faith in our old modes of thinking, and that was a problem because people need something firm to stand on, to orient themselves, and to move forward. And so Nietzsche and Dostoevsky basically both prophesied that the consequence of that dissolution would be increased probability of nihilism and everything that went along with that. And Dostoevsky wrote about that actually quite extensively in a book called Notes from Underground, which if any of you are interested, especially in clinical psychology, that's a book you should really read because it's one of the most brilliant psychological studies of a psychologically disturbed man that's ever been written. It's very accurate, and there are sections in Crime and Punishment that are like that too. I think they're unsurpassed in their representation of psychological phenomena. I don't know how he managed it. I mean, Dostoevsky was epileptic. I don't know if you know that, but he was arrested by the Tsar's men in the late 1800s for being a student radical. And they threw him in the main prison in Moscow. And then one day they took him out in front of a firing squad and shot him at 6 in the morning, but they only used blanks, which of course he didn't know about. And that scared him so badly he developed epilepsy, and then he had epilepsy. That can happen, by the way. And then he had epilepsy for the rest of his life. But he had this strange kind of epilepsy, which is actually not all that rare. Sometimes when people have epilepsy, they experience this phenomena they call an aura, which is an altered state of consciousness before the epileptic seizure hits. And they can be very strange, these auras. So I read a case study once about a guy who, his aura was that his hand was being possessed by devils from hell. And he could feel the possession move up his arm and into his shoulder, and once it hit his head, he'd have an epileptic seizure. And so then there was another case where this man, his aura was that his exact double had appeared behind him. But if he turned to look, then he'd have an epileptic seizure. But if he didn't turn to look, then he wouldn't. So these, brain disorders are very strange things because they're, well, the system that is disordered is alive and it's capable of any number of extraordinarily peculiar misbehaviors. Anyways, Dostoevsky's aura was a world-revealing aura. And so what Dostoevsky would experience was that the meaning of things got deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And then just as he was on the verge of discovering the secret to everything, he'd have an epileptic seizure. But he said that the quality of experience during the aura was so high, so overpowering and so deep that he would have traded all of his normal experience just to have had those experiences, and he had them repeatedly. And I really do believe that it was this broadening of his vision and concept by his epilepsy that transformed him, among other things. I mean, he went through some pretty damn rough experiences because he was in prison with rapists and murderers for a long time in Siberia, even though he was kind of an aristocratic guy. I mean, he had a rough time of it. And I imagine that also broadened him tremendously, given that it didn't kill him. But I really do believe that the epileptic insight was key to his unsurpassed genius. And so, his aura, and other people do experience epileptic aura symptoms like that, by the way, and some people are so enamored of the aura that they won't take their anti-epilepsy medication because they don't want to forego the experience that precedes the aura, or the actual epileptic seizure. So, Dostoevsky's experiences, the awe element of the aura, is also relevant to what we're going to talk about today, because both Binswanger and Boss were very interested in how meaning revealed itself in the world. And they had opposing explanations. I actually think they're parallel explanations, but the meaning that Dostoevsky experienced is an amplification of the normal manner in which meaning reveals itself in the world. So, I mean, and people experience that sort of thing in various altered states of consciousness. anyways, Binswanger and Boss, so they worked mostly in the 1950s, and as I said, they were very concerned about what had happened in World War II, and so Dostoevsky and Nietzsche had basically predicted that it was going to be nihilism or ideological totalitarianism, and that's basically exactly what happened. And by the time the 1930s appeared on the horizon, the Germans, who'd been, you know, they'd gone through an absolutely brutal First World War, and then they went through hyperinflation of insane proportions. So in the 1920s, Germany underwent this partly because they had such heavy war debts to pay for World War I. The German inflation got to the point where it was literally upwards of 100 million marks to buy a loaf of bread. You know, so they were taking wheelbarrows full of money to the grocery stores. You know, what happened was their currency devalued to zero. And, you know, that actually happens to economies more often than you might think. So the thing just hits zero, and that's that. And then it has to be rebooted, so to speak. So they had been, the war was dreadful, and hundreds of thousands of men were killed or brutalized. Then their economy just absolutely fell apart. And then, of course, at the same time, well, a little bit earlier, the revolution had taken place in Russia, right at the end of the First World War, and the communists had come to power, and the communists were agitating all over Europe and in North America, and, you know, their goal was to produce a communist revolution that was worldwide. And so the Germans were all shorted out that the communists were going to take over the country, which was a perfectly reasonable fear. And, you know, instead of that, what happened was that fascism arose, and fascism was a form of state totalitarianism. And I think the Germans were so desperate for order by that point that, and that's what the fascists basically offered them, at least in theory. Unfortunately, as it turned out, they offered them a little bit too much order, or maybe a lot too much order, and things went dreadfully south. But, you know, so then the whole world had to walk through the horrors of World War II, and it was shocking in a variety of ways, not only because of the brutality of the warfare, but because of the genocidal actions that took place consciously by the Nazis. And, you know, and those actions were, in many ways, very difficult to understand. I mean, and here's why they're particularly difficult to understand. There were certainly times where the brutality that the Nazis employed in their eradication of their theoretical enemies far surpassed the necessity for the mere eradication. But even worse than that, so it went past eradication into real torture constantly. And not only that, there are many situations in which the Nazis, especially near the end of the war, they had to decide really whether they were going to continue exterminating Jews and gypsies and homosexuals and all the people they felt didn't fit into their culture, or whether they were going to win the war. And there were decisions they had to make about the distribution of resources, where if they were going to pursue the genocidal extermination, that would mean it would decrease the probability that they would win the war. And that happened a lot, especially at the end, and the Nazis always picked continuing the extermination. Now that's pretty damn interesting, you know, because you can think, well, on the one hand, you know, if they are serving a creed, and the creed is world domination, and this is, the extermination processes are considered a step towards the actual end point, which is the establishment of a world state, a fascist world state, or at least a fascist European state, then you would think that the extermination attempts would be subordinate to that goal if they were actually pursuing the goal that they said they were pursuing. But, you know, there's an old psychoanalytic idea which is really worthwhile. It's like a surgical tool, and I would say if you're going to use it in your own life, use it carefully, because you don't want to do unnecessary surgery. And the rule is, and I think this is a Jungian rule, but I can't remember exactly where I read it. If you can't understand why someone is doing something, look at the consequences of their actions, whatever those might be, and then infer the motivation from the consequences. So if you see someone who seems to be doing nothing except making everyone around them and themselves miserable, and you can't understand why, one of the hypotheses that you might entertain is that they're trying to make everyone around them miserable as well as themselves, and that's actually their goal. And it's hard for people to understand these sorts of things, because when we see phenomena like the Columbine shooters, you know, we always assume that the reason that these people are doing these sorts of things is for other reasons than the reasons they the reasons that appear to motivate them, or even the reasons they say they're doing it, because the Columbine killer, especially the more literate one, he said exactly why he was doing what he was doing. It's as clear as it could possibly be. All you have to do is go online and read what he said, and he tells you what he was up to. But people don't like to think that way because they don't believe that anybody could be consciously possessed of that much malevolence without there being some other kind of cause, like, you know, he was bullied at school, or, you know, he was an outcast. And those things were only vaguely true, and they certainly weren't more true of him than they were true of, you know, how many people in high school are, you know, bullied and somewhat outcast. Jesus, it must be 10%. It's probably more like 30. You know, that doesn't mean that the schools are blowing up all over, you know, all the time. It's a completely insufficient explanation. Anyways, for whatever reason, you know, people turn to possession by very, very strict ideological ideas, and, you know, they were willing to be possessed by those ideas to the point where they would undertake actions that you'd think would be completely impossible for theoretically civilized people. You know, it turned out that those actions not only were not impossible for civilized people, but that the people themselves, you know, especially in Nazi Germany, they pretty much knew what the hell was going on, you know. You don't take several million people out of your population without rumors spreading, let's say. And so, you know, we should never forget that Hitler was elected, you know, and he was elected by a large majority too. It was a landslide vote, the kind of vote that no modern democratic leader ever gets. So, you know, although it's difficult for people to swallow, it's hard not to assign culpability for what happened in Germany to the society at every strata. You can't just dump it on the leaders. And in fact, one of the things that here's something to think about with regards to Hitler. So, because one of the things you might ask is, how the hell could he be so absolutely compelling to his audiences? But here I'll give you an explanation. So let's make a few assumptions. And the first assumption is there are a lot of resentful Germans kicking around. Why? Well, they lost the First World War. That wasn't so good. And then there were a lot of brutal men left because they'd been in the trenches and they'd been fighting and shooting at each other under absolutely abhorrent conditions for like years and years. And so there were plenty of brutalized men around. And then their whole damn economy collapsed because they were forced into signing what historians regard as a very punitive peace treaty. And so, like, everything had fallen apart to a degree that we can't even begin to imagine. And so, you know, in the 1930s, the Germans were starting to get back on their feet. And when Hitler came to power, he started not only to rearm, but to reindustrialize the economy. And he was actually pretty damn good at that. So now, Hitler was a good orator, but it isn't exactly clear that he was a coherent philosophical theorizer, although to think of him as stupid is completely missing the point. He was by no means stupid. I wouldn't say that he was particularly educated, but he had a very powerfully developed aesthetic sense, and he spent a lot of his time designing the cities that would be built after World War II was over, and those cities were generally conceptualized by him as places where the arts, or at least the Nazi version of the arts, could flourish. You know, so there's no real evidence that what was wrong with the Nazis was that they weren't civilized. There's more evidence, actually, I think, that they were too civilized, and I'll talk to you about that later. But anyways, you think, how did Hitler get all these people under his spell? Well, here's a hypothesis that's basically derived from Jungian thinking, and I should let you know, by the way, because sometimes Jung has been accused of being an anti-Semite, and there's various reasons for this, partly because of what happened during World War II, and partly because his theory drew heavily from Christianity, although from many other sources as well, and he did believe that there were differences in the psychology of people with different ethnicities. And now, you know, whether that's racist or not depends on whether or not you like the person you're talking to, because the lefties think that there are cultural differences and they're important, but if you ever talk about them in the wrong way, then you're racist. And the right-wingers, well, they just think there are ethnic differences to begin with. So it's a tricky issue. If there aren't differences that are important, then who the hell cares about multiculturalism? It's not even worth preserving. And if there are differences, well, then you're stuck with having to deal with the differences. So you're basically screwed either way. So anyways, Jung has been the target of many accusations of anti-Semitism, particularly by biographers who were resentful and clueless and historically uninformed and I would say malevolent, fundamentally. He worked as a CIA agent, it was just revealed last year, and he provided psychological reports to the American government on the underlying psychological structure of the Nazi leaders for years. And he never told anybody about that while he was alive. It only came to light, as far as I know, last year, or perhaps the year before that. So anyways, the Germans, you know, they weren't very happy about the whole damn situation. And so when they were aggregating en masse, you think, well, what happens when all people get together in a group? You know, we talked about that last time when we talked about Kierkegaard's idea that as soon as you get a bunch of people together, no matter how truthful they are all as individuals, instantly the crowd is not a truthful thing. And, you know, there are real reasons for that, real psychological reasons. So there's the famous Asch experiments. I hope that those are the right experiments, A-S-C-H, about line length, you know. So you draw two lines on the board and they're the same length and you get the crowd to, you know, collaborate with you and you ask some poor sucker who doesn't know about the game to play and, you know, you ask one person and they say, no, those lines are different in length. And you ask another person, they say, well, yeah, they're quite different in length. And another person says, yeah, sure, I can see the difference in length. And then you ask the poor pigeon, you know, are they different in length? And he says, yes, you know, and you can understand why. It's like, if all those other people are saying it, there's either something wrong with all of them, which seems unlikely, or he's the victim of a conspiracy, which is a little on the paranoid side, but happens to actually be true in this case, or he's just not looking at it right. And you might think, well, the humble thing to think is he's wrong. And so, you know, the fact that somebody might go along with the crowd, you know, you can blame that on their ability to be social and conventional, which in many ways is a huge advantage, because if you are all antisocial and unconventional, you know, I mean, there'd be a good chunk of you in jail, and we certainly wouldn't be having this, you know, delightful, peaceful conversation that we're having. So, you know, you don't want to underestimate the utility of conventionality to too much of a degree. Anyway, so there's this funny story I read once. I don't think it's true, but it might be, where a psychology class got together and decided they'd play a trick on the professor. And the trick was that he would walk back and forth, and the trick was that they wouldn't pay any attention to him at all if he was on the left side of the room. You know, they'd talk a bit and look up. And if he was on the right side of the room, then they'd really focus in and pay attention. And the story goes that by several weeks of this little trick, they had him like lecturing right beside the door, you know, and he wouldn't move from that spot. And so the reason I'm telling you that is because it's pretty obvious that people can respond to the cues that a crowd is delivering. You know, and a good speaker does that, right? So a good speaker does a variety of things, and one is he never talks to the crowd per se. You know, you pick out specific individuals and talk to them, and they're sort of reflective of the crowd, and then you can tell if everybody's understanding. And the other thing that a good speaker does is pay attention to the damn responses of the crowd, because, you know, if a lecture is really a dialogue, even though the audience is only emitting the nonverbal elements of the conversation, those nonverbal elements, those damn things are important. So you want to stay in touch with the nonverbal communications. Now, Hitler, he's kind of a chaotic guy, you know. He's very angry. He's angry in part because he was a frustrated art student. He tried to get into art school like 4 times, so really the person to blame for World War II was the 4-person committee that wouldn't let poor Hitler into I believe it was the Viennese School of Art, because he really wanted to go. You know, and he had some artistic talent. He was a little on the conventional side, by all appearances, but, you know, I've seen some of his sketches, and, you know, he wasn't a complete piker, and he kind of felt maybe it would be okay for him to go to university, because he'd just been through World War I, you know, and that wasn't much fun. There's a story about Hitler where he was out in the trenches, and he was there with all his buddies, and he wandered off to do whatever he wandered off to do, and when he came back they were all dead because a bomb had landed right in the middle of them. And, you know, you might think that would do a little something to your psyche, because after an experience like that, you're either going to think, oh man, things are pretty damn random and horrible, or there's something pretty damn special about me, because I wasn't killed by the bomb, you know. Maybe God has saved me for a higher purpose. I mean, you can be absolutely sure that if you went through an experience like that something like that would be rattling around in your mind. And he won a medal for bravery. You know, so and then after World War I, he kind of wandered around like a lot of men, unemployed and sort of like a tramp, you know. So he wasn't very happy about that, and you know, no wonder. So anyways, he didn't get into art school. Now, he didn't really have a fully developed political theory, you know, but he was pretty good at speaking. So, and there were lots of people who would come to hear him speak because people were sort of trying to figure out what the hell to do about all the chaos, you know. So then you think, well, what was Hitler good at? Well, okay, now I'm going to switch to a slightly different story, and then I'll get back to this one. So, I don't know if you guys know about the daycare scandals that were very, very common in the 1980s. So, horribly common, actually. This infested many towns. And usually what would happen is somebody who was a little on the paranoid side, or maybe a lot on the paranoid side, would send their children off to daycare. And that was a whole new thing in the 80s, right? Because women were, you know, moving into the workforce like mad, and so they were handing over often their infants, kids below 3, say, to total strangers. And, you know, for some of them, that set up a fair bit of worry, like it still does, and sometimes that worry got out of hand, especially among the people who are a little predisposed to paranoid schizophrenia, and maybe even had some previous episodes. And so, you know, the kid would come home, and the mother would observe, or not, something kind of peculiar about their behavior, and then she'd fantasize about maybe what that was, and then, you know, she'd start asking the child if the child had been touched in any particular way, and, you know, and she'd keep this up for a good length of time, and then the child would start to have nightmares, and then the child would tell the mother about what the nightmares were, and then that would freak her out, and so she'd ask even deeper questions, and soon, you know, her children were telling her that horrible things were happening to them at daycare. And so then she'd go to the police, and they wouldn't look into her psychiatric background, and then the police would go out and they'd start to interview other children. And if they interviewed them properly, then the other children would start to produce all these stories as well. Now, how did that happen? Well, a bunch of ways. The first is, the police would ask leading questions, like, did anyone touch you? Well, of course, someone touched the kids. I mean, people touch kids. Did anybody touch you there? Well, that's not a question. That's a piece of information. The piece of information is, if someone touched me there, an adult would be very interested in that, right? So now, what's a child doing when he's answering an adult's questions? Well, the child doesn't bloody well know. What the hell do they know? They're like 3, you know. They can hardly organize their story. You know, if you're talking to a kid and you want to get them to give you an account of their day, you have to really guide them through the organization of their memory. And partly what they're doing when you're doing that is they're looking at you, trying to figure out if they're telling you the right things, which is what they should be doing, because what they're trying to learn to do is to tell people things in a way that they'll understand them. But that makes the child very, very responsive to the nonverbal and verbal cues of the adult. You think about how fast those little rats learn how to pick up language, you know. It's really very fast, and no one really teaches them. They're just paying attention like mad. So you get a bunch of cops who are on a half-cocked adventure, and they think there's some serial sexual pervert in their midst, and they go interview, you know, 15, 20 kids, and they do it a lot, and they use little dolls, and they do it a lot, and they do it a lot, and they do it a lot, and sooner or later all the kids start having nightmares, and then they start telling the cops there's all these terrible things happen, like they're taken into underground caverns and they're stripped naked and they're forced to like leapfrog over each other, and like you just can't believe it, what happened. You can't believe it. It's all documented in a book called Satan's Silence, which was written by a social worker and a lawyer. It's mind-boggling. The longest prison sentences in American history were handed out to a series of middle-aged women who were taking care of little kids. And the FBI even came up with a whole new criminal category. Late onset female sexual offender. Well, why didn't that category exist before? It's simple. There are no late onset middle-aged female sexual offenders. That's why we didn't need the category. But once all these accusations came up, well, poof, you know, you had to have some damn category for these poor women. Some of them were put in jail for 350 years, which seems a bit excessive, given that they're only going to last about 40. You know, they'd get 12 consecutive life sentences. So, and you know, there was actually a situation where one town went so far as to start digging underneath the town to find these underground satanic lairs where all these weird ritual things were going on. You know, and along with this was not one shred of concrete evidence. You know, and the eventual conclusions, and this affected thousands of people, the eventual conclusions was, well, there actually isn't anybody who's, you know, satanically torturing children in daycare centers. Now, anyways, why am I telling you this? Well, what the children were doing, you think about it, how the hell did the children come up with these weird ideas? You know, I mean, first of all, we should note that children are not stupid. And they can also dream up the most horrible things, you know, because they have an imagination that's capable of extending itself out into the terrifying. Now, everyone knows that, because all you have to do is remember when you were a kid, and, you know, when you were hiding under the covers because there were horrible things in your dark room. You know, you can populate the darkness with monsters with no problem, and you should be able to, because there are monsters in the darkness. Even though your parents might tell you there aren't, it's like there might not be any monsters in that particular piece of darkness, and that's a perfectly reasonable thing to tell your children. But in the darkness as a whole, it's like, yeah, look the hell out. So the children aren't stupid. Now, so then the adults start to question them, and the kids are, the back of their brain, the little imaginative part is thinking, what do these people want? What do these people want? What do these people want? And so they'll throw them out a little bit of information, and the adults will perk up. They'll focus right on that piece of information. So maybe it's a cop who really hates child Satanist abductors, which, you know, is a perfectly reasonable stance. And so when the child offers any information about the existence of such a thing, well, the cop will perk up. And then the child thinks, oh, I see, well, so sort of what's going on seems to have something to do. They don't think this consciously, you know, but their imagination is working. How do I model the reality that's being presented to me? And that's when the dreams start to kick in too. Okay, so by speaking in the appropriate way, you can get all sorts of things churned up in the unconscious minds of your listeners. And by watching them as well, you can extract out their unconscious desires. So now, I'm speaking to you all, and you're all irritated because your life has been really awful for 15 years. And I'm saying this, and I'm saying that, and I'm saying this, and I'm saying that. You know, and then I say something, maybe I say something initially dismissive of Jews. And you're all mad, and there's 2 or 3 people who go, yeah! And then I think, oh, you know, that's kind of an interesting response. And then, you know, I lay out a couple more ideas, and some of them don't get any response, and others, you know, people perk right up. And I'm not stupid, and I'm trying to get the bloody attention of the crowd. And so, if I do that 50 times, the crowd's going to tell me an awful lot about what they want, especially if I'm willing to follow them. And I can do that easily, because especially if I can start to work the crowd a little bit, because I can capitalize on their capitalize on their emotions and the display of that emotion, and I can learn to play that. And then that turns into a positive feedback loop. And so Hitler's informing the audience, and the audience is informing Hitler, and that's why Jung believed that Hitler embodied the shadow of the German people. So that's another reason why you should be careful what you say, and why you say it, you know, and why you're looking for attention, and all of those things, and actually what's motivating you, and actually what's motivating the people who are listening to you. Because God only knows where it might go if you're not careful. Well, actually, we do know where it goes if you're not careful. And it's not pretty, that's for sure. And to think that we've learned anything from that, it's like, no, that's not right. We haven't learned a damn thing from it. So, because we don't want to understand it. Now, these guys were all concerned with that sort of thing. They're highly concerned with it. Now, Binswanger and Boss had both been influenced by Freud and by Jung. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner there, that's Boss with Jung, and that's Binswanger on the left and Boss at the top there. So, you know, they're pretty thoughtful-looking guys, and they were pretty damn smart. and they were quite philosophically oriented, and they had both studied Heidegger and they'd both studied Husserl, who were German philosophers. Heidegger actually got tangled right up into the Nazi movement, and his philosophy has been cast under a cloud of suspicion, perhaps a well-deserved cloud of suspicion, as a consequence of his cooperation with the Nazis. So it wasn't only stupid people who got tangled up in this, it was pretty much everybody who got tangled up in it. And one of the things you might think about, and this is worth thinking about, is that if you were there, for any one of you, there's a 90% chance that you would have got tangled up in it. You wouldn't have been the person who rescued the gypsies. It's like, forget that. It's like, unless you think that you're heroic far beyond the average, and I would be very, very careful about assuming that. You could assume instead that you would have been swept along with the crowd just like everyone else, because everyone else was. All right, now, part of what these guys were trying to figure out is, in some sense, there were two things. There was the function and structure of belief systems, and then the nature of that which transcends a belief system. Okay, so, what transcends a belief system is what you don't know if you use that belief system, right? Because there are things outside of your belief system, and they have a nature as well. And you usually run into those sorts of things when you make a mistake, and things don't happen the way you expect them to, or want them to, or desire them to. So, and then the other problem they're trying to solve in some sense is, well, what's the appropriate mode of behavior for an individual in relationship to belief systems and to the world that transcends the belief systems? And the reason they were interested in that is because they thought, well, maybe it would be a good idea if our belief systems didn't get so damn pathological. Because if they do, then, 6 million people end up in ovens or the equivalent, and 120 million people end up dead in battlefields, and, that doesn't count the Stalin massacres or Mao, who were, made Hitler in some sense look like an absolute amateur. I mean, Stalin starved 6 million people to death in the Ukraine in the 1930s, and he was just warming up. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Ukraine famine? How many of you haven't? Yeah, well, think about that. How many of you knew Mao killed 100 million people? How many of you didn't? Yeah, well, you might think about why you don't know that. You know about the damn Nazis, but you don't know about the horrors that the communists perpetrated. It's worth thinking about why. Because the communists, especially the Maoists, man, those people were brutal. So, it's really important, like, of all the things we could possibly learn psychologically from the 20th century, and is what these characters in the 50s were concentrating on. It's like, okay, things can go powerfully sideways. It was quite a shock to everyone, because in some sense, everyone was pretty thrilled at the beginning of the 19th century that religion, classical religion beliefs had crumbled. The Marxists said, well, the damn religions were only there to oppress the poor anyways, and to keep the priesthood and the aristocracy in power. I'm sure you learn plenty of that in your classes, that sort of thinking. It's power, economics related thinking, and it's typical of what would you say? Intellectually manipulative left-wing thinkers, I would say. That's basically their routine. They reduce everything to a single damn motivation. It's usually economics or power. And then they explain everything from that perspective. It's like, it's so boneheaded, it should be illegal. Anyways, the Marxists were happy that religion had collapsed because they thought that that would eliminate an entire strata of oppression. And you can see that. It's not like the Catholic Church, for example, was free of corruption. It was in many ways a corrupt enterprise. And you could read it as solely a corrupt enterprise, and, to hell with it. It's good that it's gone. And, the Freudians basically thought the same way, and so did most intellectuals. Freud thought that religion was nothing than a childish delusion that people identified with because they were afraid of dying. It was a defense against death anxiety. Look, the Marxist argument and the Freudian argument, those are bloody powerful arguments, because you can see it. Do people use their religious belief as a defense against things they're too terrified to confront? Well, obviously. Does the church oppress people? Did it oppress people? Did it engage in conspiracies with people in power across centuries? It's like, obviously, the question is, well, what do you make of that? Well, partly you make of it that all sorts of structures do that. It's like structures do that, and, you can't just damn one structure and think the others are going to, you know, it's like the right-wingers, they're always on about big government, how terrible that is, and the left-wingers are always on about how big corporations are terrible. It's like, well, big is terrible. It doesn't matter if it's government or corporations, because things tend to tilt towards corruption across time, and that has to be taken into account. But anyway, so the Freudians and the intellectuals and the Marxists were all pretty happy when the religious dream started to come apart, and they believed that the new edifices that they were going to construct, fascist and communist, would be so much better than what they replaced that, you know, everybody would be drowning in utopia. And it's kind of too bad that isn't how it turned out. But it's certainly not how it turned out. How it turned out was, sometimes when you tear something down, even if you think it's terrible, you end up constructing something on its ruins that makes the previous terrible look like the work of rank amateurs. And that's certainly what happened in the 20th century. I mean, no matter what you say about the Catholic Church and its basic barbarism, especially when, you know, they were involved in the witch hunt in the Middle Ages, it's like, those guys, they were amateurs compared to the fascists and the communists. You know, they were counting their victims in the tens of thousands, not the hundreds of millions. So anyways, things didn't go so well. And so by the 1950s, especially because the Cold War started the day the Second World War ended, right? And it ended with the atomic bomb in Japan, and the Russians had the damn atomic bomb like, you know, tomorrow, fundamentally, and both the Russians and the Americans had the hydrogen bomb by the early 1950s. And I don't know if you know this. You can tell me how many of you know this. Do you know that a hydrogen bomb uses an atom bomb for its trigger? Okay. So, the hydrogen bombs, the atom bomb stands in relationship to a hydrogen bomb, like the ignition cap on a shell stands in relationship to the gunpowder. The atomic blast just gets the explosion going. So hydrogen bombs, they're like way, way more explosive than atomic bombs. And so, you know, by the middle of the 1950s, we'd pretty much put ourselves in a position where, and they were building some mighty big bombs. I mean, really unbelievably big bombs. You know, 400 times as big as the ones that wiped out Hiroshima. Like huge, huge bombs. And they were getting pretty damn good at it, you know. So by the mid-1950s, it was like we'd developed enough firepower on both sides of the Atlantic, along with the missiles necessary to deliver them, which the Nazis had basically invented in World War II, right? It was all Nazi scientists who invented rockets, and they were all taken by the Americans after the Second World War to work on the American space program, basically. And so by the 1950s, we had the missiles to deliver the damn things too. So not only were the psychologists who were thinking about things sort of shorted out about what happened in World War II, for good reason, and then of course all the Stalinist horrors were starting to be revealed at that point, although it took Western intellectuals like 30 years before they gave them any credence at all. I think Jean-Paul Sartre was still a member of the Communist Party up until 1970. It was very common, particularly among French intellectuals. You know, even though the news was getting out, careful observers like George Orwell had pretty much figured out by the late 30s that not all was right in the paradise of Stalin. But, you know, people thought he was a right-winger and didn't listen to him much, even though he was a left-winger. So these existential phenomenologists, they're trying to figure out, okay, we got a big problem here. The belief systems are seriously going sideways. And there's some indication, you know, there's some individual responsibility for that, of some indeterminate nature. Like, if you live in a country where everyone's turned into a fascist murderer, like, is that your fault? Well, you know, it's not obvious that an individual should be held responsible for the actions of an entire country, but then again, the country's made up of individuals, so it's a very difficult problem to solve. You know, and one of the tenets of Western law is that you don't hold an individual responsible for the actions of the group, even if he or she happens to be a member, willingly or unwillingly, of that group. But you can't ignore the fact that all these things were made up of people. And then you also can't ignore the fact that it was individuals who were doing the terrible things that were being done to people, you know.